Welcome to another episode of Jews and the World. Today, I'm going to be speaking with author David Tabatsky, who wrote the young adult book, The Boy Behind the Door, How Salomon Kuhl Escaped the Nazis. And this is a YA book that's historical fiction. And David's going to start by telling you how he got involved in the project. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thanks for having me today. So, The Boy Behind the Door, How Salomon Kuhl Escaped the Nazis. Yes, it's a work of historical fiction, and it tells the story of Salomon Kuhl, who was a 12-year-old boy in the beginning of the book in Amsterdam in 1940. Now, just for the backstory, how this even happened, I was living in New York City, where I still live, and a Jewish businessman from Scarsdale, New York, which is a suburb of Manhattan, and it's kind of a well-known enclave of, let's just say, upscale Jews who have good incomes, good family, great schools there, blah blah blah. And Sandy Batkin was involved in the Jewish community, and he had an affinity for supporting the state of Israel. And this was also in the early decade or two after the Holocaust. So in the early 1960s, Sandy and his wife took a vacation. They were in the island of Aruba, which is a Dutch colonial island. I think it might be independent now, but at the time it was still a Dutch colony. And that's where a lot of people from Holland would go on their own vacations. And so Salomon Kuhl and his wife Nettie, they were there coincidentally also at the same time on a vacation. It was early 60s. And they met standing in the ocean, literally. Sandy and Saul were just standing there. I don't know where their wives were, but they were just standing there, just, having a nice little day in the ocean, as people do. And they just got to talking. Who are you? Who are you? Like, what's your background? They were both realized they were both Jewish. And then, okay, so at that time, I think a lot of Jews, even when the ones who could afford it, hadn't done a lot of traveling necessarily internationally, and hadn't, Americans can be very cloistered in their own bubble, especially back then when air travel wasn't as common yet. And so it was an unusual thing. It was really kind of fascinating for Sandy to meet somebody from Europe. Oh, and a European Jew. Oh my God, what a novelty. And it was a little fascinating for Saul too. And Saul was pretty quiet, reserved, and Sandy was a little bit more outgoing. So he was kind of poking around, like, tell me about this, tell me about that. Finally, it became clear that Salomon Kuhl was a Holocaust survivor. And this really hit Sandy like a ton of bricks right there, standing in this beautiful, idyllic place. He was like, oh my God, where was I during the Second World War? And where were you? And how different that is. And yet here we are standing in the same ocean, talking to each other. Have you told your story? Because this was the first time Sandy, I think, had met like peer to peer, same age, give or take. Um, and so on the one hand, they could have everything in common. On the other hand, they had nothing in common. Um, but yet there was some shared experience there. And Sandy had such aspirations to support the state of Israel and to assert his Jewish identity and support it around in a global way with whatever he could financially and spiritually and everything else through his synagogue and through various Jewish organizations. But on a very personal, visceral level, he was really touched by Saul. Saul's a very unassuming man, very gentle, very quiet, and I think he's very endearing when you meet him. You can't help it. And I imagine he was too back then in the 60s when he was much younger, but also still carrying the wounds of the war, which we'll get into more when we speak of the story. But to jump the gun, because obviously we know the historical context of the Holocaust, he lost so many people, and had survivor's guilt, which was still, I would say, almost evident in his very being, standing there in the early 60s, basically 15, 17, or 18 years later. When you look at that in a historical perspective, that's not very much. That's really a short time. Also, when the war ended and he was 18 years old, he became a man in the years ensuing, but carried that youthful part of him that lived through the war and survived the war, and then the survivor's guilt, and simply also the grief and the pain of losing his family. That doesn't just, you know,
Dissipate.
recede into the distance, especially when you still live in the country where they were all lost, when you live literally right around the corner from your family's old apartment, where you see all the uh, tombstones and milestones and evidence of the Nazis still having a presence in that city, even though they're not physically there anymore. And all of those remnants are gone. The shadows all remain. The ghosts remain. The memories, all of that. And it doesn't take much to stir them. Even now, if you're there and you walk around Amsterdam with some of that in mind, it resonates very quickly. You can almost hear it. You know.
My daughter and I took a private Jewish tour of the old Jewish quarter in Amsterdam in this past May 2023. So I
Okay.
very much know what you're talking about.
So
And
you really know, it's there. It's in the cobblestones. It's not, it's nothing's gone really. It's been sterilized like it is in many places. And on a sunny day, if you looked at the entry to a concentration camp somewhere in the sunny day would be a nice sunny day. That's still a reality. But what is the sun shining on? And does the sun fully rise and shine for someone who is a survivor? And there's a spectrum of answers there. But I can only speak for Saul and know that even as an old man, when I did meet him, which I'll get to in a moment, he still carried that survivor's guilt. It was there. It was quietly there all through his life. So I think it was probably even more evident to Sandy on that sunny day, standing in the ocean in Aruba. And Sandy said, "Hey, have you told your story? You got to tell your story." And Saul was like, "Oh, no, no, no. I'm just one of millions. My story is nothing special." He downplayed it all. And I think he wanted to keep it in his rearview mirror as much as possible, but also not call attention to himself. He wasn't that type of person. And so Sandy let it go, but they remained friends. They kindled a friendship there in that day. And so they took several other vacations over the years together. They would meet somewhere. And Sandy over the years would, nudge him a little. You sure you don't want to do it? You sure you don't want to do it? And then years would go by and they didn't talk about it. And finally, as they're both realized they're getting older, and Saul has children. His two sons then emigrated to Israel, and he has grandchildren. And he was like, wow, gee, you know what? Maybe I should tell my story, even if it's just for my sons and my grandchildren, that they actually know from me, not from, other books that I kind of fit into, but from me directly. Uh, and I owe it to my family who perished. I owe it to tell their portion of the story, if you will, through my eyes. And even though they don't last very long into the book, Saul is left alone rather quickly. But still, they have a very strong presence in the beginning of the book. And so, anyway, one thing led to another, and in several years ago, Sandy, who met a literary agent uh, out on Long Island in the Hamptons, where he was, having a vacation or something, and they just met socially. And then she said, "Oh my gosh, I know a writer who might be just the right person for you, who could write this book." And so they, she hooked us up, and then after a series of meetings and negotiations and things like that, we came to a nice agreement. And And then Sandy then sent me off to Amsterdam. I went and spent about a week with Saul and his wife Nettie, and slowly but surely we walked around quite a bit of the city where he had grown up as a boy. He took me to the school where in the book, in the story, where eventually he has to escape, and they have to slide out these little windows to get away after they hear all the brown boots marching up the hallway, and they're looking for Jewish children and Jewish teachers, and to nobody knows exactly, are they going to take them away, or are they just going to intimidate, are they going to bully, or are they actually going to arrest them? No, it wasn't clear, but they escaped. And then to the Jewish theater, which, the famous Jewish theater of Amsterdam became the collection point where they were put on trains to go to various camps. And the cynical, deep irony and just the levels of evil in that you take the Jews and round them up and put them in the Jewish theater, the such a strong, important place in that city for the Jewish community, which was very large at that time, the beginning of the war. And then across the street from that Jewish theater, which is being renovated and rebuilt as we speak still. I was just there recently, and it's the scaffolding is still up, but it's going to be finished fairly soon, this year in 24. And across the street was what's called the creche, which is kind of like the nursery / kindergarten, where traditionally that's where little children, would be, taught, and like a daycare center into a nursery school, kindergarten, yeah, for young children and babies. And that's where the babies and the young children of these Jews who were rounded up, they were separated. And so parents were separated from their children, but the awful torture of it, even before they were sent away on the trains, because sometimes they would be in that Jewish theater for days on end until they were, delegated where they were going to go. They knew right across the street, where they literally, some of them could see right across the street is my child, my baby, my son, my daughter, all alone with whoever, the Dutch nurses and social workers were looking after them. And this is where Saul, luckily, was able to go, because when he was finally taken as a young teenager, he was undersized for his age. He looked much younger, which ended up to be his saving grace. If he had looked his age at I think 16 at the time, 15 or 16, he would have gone to the camps. Absolutely. He would have gone and perished with his family. Fortunately, if you might say, although he sometimes didn't think it was so fortunate, he also sometimes would still feel, even as an old man, I wish I had just gone to the camps and died with my family rather than go through what I went through. I think the brain plays a lot of tricks with people in that regard. There's a lot of testimony to that effect. It's not just Saul, but it's kind of a universal thing. Not just the Holocaust, but anytime there's a genocide, the survivors go through quite, I don't know, a unique psychology, let's say, in the rest of their lives, and how they find a place for it, how they rationalize, and how they survive. But anyway, we spent that time together in Amsterdam, and Saul basically shared with me as much as he could remember. He said certain things I feel like I must have blocked out, not even realizing it, because they were still too traumatic. The nights or the places, the times when I had to escape and run and hide in alleyways and under the bridge and here and there in the city to avoid, being shot or killed or arrested. Those are not memories that the brain feels comfortable to keep and store. We push them away for our own survival. And it was a painful time for him, and I tried to be very gentle with him and careful to not upset him in the wrong way. But he said, no, I think I have to. You have to it's okay. You have to push me there because I need it to try to find maybe things I didn't remember for a long time. And then he told me things and he said, oh my gosh, I'm telling you things I never even told my own children. Um, because it just never, I never got that far. I never could go into my own memory in that same way, out of my own, whether my own self-protection or protecting them. And I said, well, they're grown men now and they don't need your protection, but they do need your story, and their children too. And you'd be doing people a lot of favors by sharing it. And we talked about that. And I kind of shared with him my vision of how this story could resonate for young boys who need to be educated, um, even more in some ways than girls, because also it's the male species that instigate wars in general. It's rarely a woman or a group of women who create war. It's men. And so let's help them when they're boys to maybe not do that. And stories like this will contribute. And when I gave him that perspective, I think that really helped him have the courage to retell as much as he could and to share with me as much information. And so when you asked before about whether this book is a novel or historical fiction, there really is a distinction because, especially with a subject like the Holocaust, yes, you can take liberties, for example, in writing the dialogue when Saul and his siblings are teasing each other around the dinner table when they're 12, 14, 16, 18 years old, the big brothers and his big sister teasing him when he's going to become bar mitzvah. Oh, you're a man now, blah, blah, all those things. Those carry through the same way they would right now if you had a family of people who the language might be slightly different, of course, and the idiomatic suggestions and things like that. But the family dynamic is still similar. You still got the mother who's running the household. You have the father who plays his role. Those dynamics are no different now than they were then in the essential human interactions. So yes, I wrote the dialogue. He didn't retell me, oh, this is what my sister said, and then I said this, and then he said that. Come on, it was like 70 years ago. It's impossible. You don't remember that stuff. And so, yes, I made that up. And he read it all and said, oh my gosh, I don't know how you did it, but that sounds like me and my siblings. And it was actually quite emotional for him to read that, reliving that interaction with them, because he hadn't had it. They were all, they all were murdered in the war. So he never had any more communication with them from the day they disappeared. Three of them, one at a time, they just disappeared from one minute to the next. They just didn't come home that day from school or work or wherever. And no one knew where they were, or he didn't find out until long after the war. It wasn't even a quick remedy for him to know. It took quite a bit of time after the war. It was very chaotic. Even though the records were very organized, there was a long period of chaos before those records were made clear to everyone. Even when it was your own family you were searching for. The Dutch government was in total chaos after the war, very disorganized, just trying to put the pieces back together. And so helping their own citizens find their families actually really wasn't a priority. They were dealing with trying just to make things work for the living. They had no room or resources too much to try to account for the dead in the immediate times. Later, yes, very exacting and very precise. And the records are remarkable. Thank goodness we have those. Otherwise, a lot of people wouldn't even believe it happened. When you get into all that, thank God all the Holocaust deniers will eventually run into a brick wall because the facts speak for themselves and the documentation of them is so layered and substantial that they can't really be refuted. And so, anyway, the purpose of this book was to find its own voice for young readers to understand it, because just in general, kids, well, that's an adult thing. That's like for my parents, or
Mm.
that's not my life. And that's fine. That's normal. Um, just as parents, sometimes, well, that's a kid thing, and so they're not relatable. But I thought every generation needs to relearn, or learn really for the first time, what this is. And it can't all be information passed down from teachers to children or parents to children. They have to have an avenue to learn it and digest it on their own, and own it, and have agency, as you said, using that word, have agency over it, to decide where's the right or wrong, where's the good or bad in all of this, so that they can have consequential decisions of their own about how they want to lead their own lives, and what they want to do to make the world the right place for anybody to live in. So in a small way, I hope that this book will do a little bit to move the needle, for those kids who read it, or the classrooms maybe who will read it and discuss it, and use Saul's story as a trigger for positive discussion and continued education. Um,
I
and
also,
I just want one more thing,
yeah,
like, obviously Saul's parents were murdered, but it's not the story of him getting killed. It's the story of him surviving. And so in a way, he wasn't like on the front lines fighting. He wasn't in the concentration camp. We've got so many of those stories. There aren't as many stories of what happened in a different kind of real life, one that's actually more relatable. Anybody could go visit Amsterdam, and it's an active city, and it still has all the alleyways and things that it did back then. They don't look really any different in a lot of ways, in certain parts of the city. But you can't go to a concentration camp and imagine, yes, you can feel, but you can't, it's not a living place. It's not a concentration camp. It's now a museum, right? So that's very different than the story of someone who just went through, quote unquote, very normal things in order to survive. You know,
y-
um, things that are relatable, I think, in a different way. Right.
what I wanted to say is it's also important that it's a book about the Netherlands, because I was at the Eradicate Hate Summit in Pittsburgh in September. They have it
Mm-hmm.
every year. I highly recommend the summit. But the young man next to me, now remember, this is a self-selected group who came to this summit. I said something about my co-host uh, on my Never Again Is Now podcast being a Dutch Jew, and that her parents had survived. And he had no idea that he said the Holocaust was in Holland. He said, I just think it's about Poland and stuff. I
Yeah.
think he said and stuff. I'm sorry, Poland and such countries. So I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I'm going to include with this description a link to the podcast I did for my other channel, in which we interviewed Daniel Libeskind, who designed the Dutch memorial of names of Holocaust victims. So if people go to Amsterdam, it's outside, you don't have to pay admission. It's a really amazing
I
memorial.
know. Yeah, I know Daniel Libeskind. I met him when I lived in Berlin, because he designed the Jewish Museum in Berlin,
Yes,
and
yes.
it opened. I was living there around that time when he was working on it. So, and his sister has written a book about their family. Who were Holocaust survivors. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh, so yeah, I think that's important also for people in Europe. Even people in Europe don't realize where all of the everything happened, and the extent of the reach, and how it uprooted an entire nation for decades afterwards. The Jewish population in the Netherlands was large in proportion to the size of the country. and especially in Amsterdam, where the Jews were mostly concentrated. Some in Rotterdam and some in The Hague, but the biggest,
Right.
the active population was in Amsterdam, of course. And I mean, they were essentially almost the entire population was essentially annihilated. And the Jewish population there now is obviously quite a rebuild. It's not much of a continuation. It's new, relatively new, and a lot of people don't realize that. Just like they don't necessarily realize where the Holocaust extended into a place like Estonia or Latvia. The reach of the Nazis was just unfathomable, and
I
how it
just,
affected,
yeah,
those
I just
countries.
wanted to say my mother's family came from Latvia, and we thought that everyone had left, years ago to come to America until we discovered
Mhm.
that family were murdered and that there were two survivors. And in my play, Thin Edge of the Wedge, which started me on this whole long path, I talk about when my husband and I were on our honeymoon in Israel in September of 1969. We went to the earlier Holocaust memorial that got before Yad Vashem.
Uh-huh.
And it's basically just stones commemorating different Jewish communities. And I was only 21 and a typical American Jew from a small town. I stood in front of the stone for a Greek Jewish community. And I went, there are Greek Jews. So that was number one. I didn't even know
Yeah,
there
yeah,
were
yeah,
Greek
yeah,
Jews.
yeah.
And number two, that they were then murdered in the Holocaust. And that country also, from Thessaloniki especially, had a huge, huge, huge percentage
Yes.
of murdered Jews. So I think we Jews ourselves don't understand. So when I wrote my play, I tried to get as many different places as possible to make it clear it wasn't just Poland and Germany, that it was so much wider than people realize.
Oh my God. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And how it affected each of those countries. 'Cause, and how it affected the social construct of those countries, the economy, uh, academia, it's medicine, all throughout. So
I was just want to say that I never, in 2016, my daughter and I visited Berlin,
hmm?
and I had an appointment to talk to a movie an agent at the time. And I had never thought about this until then. He talked about the brain drain. I mean, he didn't use those words, that what Germany had done to itself till now in terms of its of murdering a Jewish citizens, but that huge part of cultural, whatever we want to say, that they had literally hurt themselves for generations afterwards. And I had never thought about that until then.
That started actually long before the
Yes,
actual war started. Even in the 30s,
yes.
when so many Jews had their radar up, and they saw, uh-oh, this isn't going right. This isn't going to go well. This is only going to get worse. They were not in denial. In fact, they were extremely clear-eyed, and they were like, we need to leave before we cannot leave, before we're not able to, or before we're just killed. And so thousands and thousands of Jews left Germany. Some of them went to America because they were like, we want to get far away. And America was the beacon of hope and freedom and things like that. Or they just would get to Belgium or France or
Not
England
far
or
enough.
somewhere closer, right? Where some of them didn't get far enough away and were murdered in other European countries, but some of them went far enough away to be safe, like England or Switzerland. Well, Switzerland, maybe not,
Yeah, let's
but
not talk about Switzerland. It's very
right. But America,
complicated.
certainly England or America or Australia or wherever, and we're safe,
And
you know,
England only because Hitler failed at invading the United Kingdom.
right.
Had he not failed, that would have been a whole nother story.
Well, the whole yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
Let's
I
not
know. We're
even go
coming
there.
kind of to the end of but I think it's important that your book is both for boys, for young people, and about Holland, and about, I agree, not someone who doesn't go to the camps, one of the things that I try in my work is to emphasize it wasn't all the camps. There's Holocaust by bullets. In fact, I'm very careful. I just read an article this week about, over 1 million were murdered at Auschwitz. I try not to use that number because then it confuses people. And they hear the 1 million Auschwitz and they say, oh, so the 6 million. So I try very carefully not to give specific numbers at camps so that people understand it's 6 million, regardless of where they were murdered or died of starvation or were shot by the Einsatzgruppen.
But besides, like what you were just saying, but how about the other millions that were completely displaced?
Yes.
Who were never able to even continue their careers. You think about how many immigrants now come to America from other countries and they're driving a taxi, but they're doctors and they're highly evolved professionals who can't get that certification in America, so they end up they're doing DoorDash. These are people with like advanced PhDs and everything who can't even get an equivalent job here. And that happened before. The other point I think that's important to mention in this story is the fact that, yes, he was 12 to 18. So it's very relatable to adolescent and teenage boys, young adults. And the thing about the Netherlands and the portrait of that country. But the other thing is also all the non-Jews who protected Saul,
yes,
who took great risk to their own family to take him in and basically for a short term adopt him and protect him and take him in as part of their family. This happened. There's a few instances of this in the book as he was forced to leave Amsterdam, and so that's an important element that's been told. Those stories have been told before, but I think every time they are told again, they're important, especially in this awful, conflicting world that we live in, to say, hey, there are room for people of totally opposite faiths, opposite belief systems to live together as one, and to humanity is it offers us that hope, and I think that this book in some ways demonstrates that in very real terms in the most inauspicious moment in history to even afford that kind of care.
Let me just emphasize what you just said, especially for young people today. The discussion after reading this book is, would you have had the courage to put your own life at risk to do what you think is right? And today, what are you willing to do to speak up for what is right? And I think,
well, I also think that there's something even more primary is, are you willing to find out what the real facts are?
ooh, I like
Are you willing to read a book like this to find out the real story and not the stuff that you're told on TikTok or Twitter? And not just get your storytelling and your news and your information from those sources. Are you willing just to sit down and read a real book that tells a real, genuine story? Because a lot of people take the short, easy way out, and they won't do that. And so then you can't call yourself a citizen of the world, even if you're a 12-year-old kid, if you're not willing to put in the time and the care to actually find out the truth.
You are so right. And since this book is really well written, I want to compliment you and easily readable. I think the adults who don't want to read long books should read this too.
Well, yeah, I've had many adults say that. And that's the thing about young adult books. I think that's why young adult books in general have so many adult fans.
Yes.
So like, let's say, hey, it doesn't matter what age you are. If you're a young adult, you're just young at heart. And young at heart means that you're still intensely curious. And hopefully, no matter what age you are, it's that curiosity, the curiosity to know the truth. And I think that's a big battle that we have in our world today. And so, maybe in a small way, that this book can go towards helping that cause, because that, if we ever when we lose that too much, then we don't have, the prospects are really bad. So, yeah.
So as we close, I do encourage you. our listeners to read the book, to share it with their school districts, etc. I sent my copy after I read it to the Gail Borden Public Library in my hometown of Elgin, Illinois, where I'm working on increasing their Holocaust book collection. But I was
Oh, good.
particularly pleased that this was a book for the high school student age, which I'm working with.
Mm-hmm.
So I highly recommend it. And I thank David very much for coming on our show.
Thank you. Can I just throw in one more thing,
Sure.
Phyllis? If people want to find out more, they just go to theboybehindthedoor.org.
Yeah, I will put,
Theboybehindthedoor.org, and there's a lot more information on the website, and then they can find out if they want to order the book, or they just can read, more backstory on it. Yeah.
and I will put that URL at the end of the description when I upload this to YouTube. So,
Thanks. Okay.
okay.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Phyllis.
And thank the listeners for another episode of Jews and the World.